Imagine this. The school day is in full swing and everything seems normal. But something horrifying happens in the principal's office. The racist principal, filled with contempt, publicly humiliates a black student, ignoring her humiliated eyes and fear. But he has no idea that the very next day everything will change when her father walks into the school. Welcome to all our viewers. Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. It's really important for us to know who you are, because each of you helps us promote our channel. You are not just viewers, you are part of our community, and every comment, every opinion is incredibly valuable to us. Your participation makes us stronger, and it is only because of you that we are able to share stories like this. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the show. The headmaster, Mr. Cross, was a man of strict rules and a stern gaze. His presence on the school grounds was felt in every corner. Teachers were afraid to question his decisions, and students were careful not to attract his attention, knowing that nothing good ever came from him. Maintaining discipline with cold determination, Mr. Cross believed that some kids needed special treatment. In Mr. Cross's eyes, children were not just students, but representatives of their families, cultures, even skin color. For him, the school hallways were a place where he defended his vision of order, as if it were a battleground for right values. He allowed himself to divide students into those he considered reliable and those who, in his opinion, always brought trouble. A girl named Alia, with dark curls and bright, inquisitive eyes, attracted his attention not by what she said or did, but simply by her existence. Her successes didn't matter to him, nor did her dreams. He saw only her skin, her background. In his opinion, Alia didn't fit into the picture of his school. He thought there were too many of her in the classrooms, in the hallways, in places where he thought there shouldn't be people like her. Mr. Cross knew that no one would dare to argue with him. His power and influence were too great. The ingrained prejudices that had become his personal rules became an invisible barrier that separated him from the children, and especially from those like Alia. Alia had always been one of those students whose presence was felt even in the silence. She was diligent and incredibly curious. Her love of knowledge made her stand out among the others. She often stayed after class, asking her teachers questions and looking for answers in books with a twinkle in her eye. Her self-confidence, this warm calmness, more than once caused admiration of classmates and respective teachers. It seemed that this girl knew who she was and what she was studying for, making steps towards her dreams every day. But to Mr. Cross, Alia was more than just an excellent student with a thirst for knowledge. Her confidence and drive stood out from his stereotypes, as if challenging him to a personal test. He saw her as a challenge of sorts, as if her success and dignity challenged his own beliefs. Alia, in his view, transcended the role he had perhaps unconsciously assigned to her, and those he felt were not worthy of being among the best. The conflict began unnoticed by the girl herself. She felt the strange, wary attitude of the headmaster, though she tried not to pay attention to it. It all began with the fact that Mr. Cross began to find every opportunity to emphasize her mistakes, however insignificant, as if under a microscope looking at her actions. For example, once Alia was a few minutes late for class, which was uncharacteristic for her. Instead of the usual reprimand, Mr. Cross did not miss the opportunity to make her tardiness the subject of public condemnation, standing in the doorway and loudly rebuking her in front of the whole class for indiscipline. It seemed a simple remark, but there was a special coldness and mockery in his voice. This incident was only the beginning. As time went on, the nagging became more and more tangible and painful. Even when Alia answered correctly or helped other students, the principal would find a way to turn it against her. He would interrupt her answer, pointing out a mistake, or make her retell assignments again, as if her efforts were of no value. At every opportunity, he tried to undermine her confidence, and Alia felt more and more strongly that there was more behind it than just her behavior or performance. One of the most painful incidents for Alia was in her literature class. where she presented a research paper on a topic she had been working on extensively. She was proudly recounting her findings when Mr. Cross suddenly stopped her and accused her of not knowing the basics and taking the wrong approach. He emphasized it so rudely that Aaliyah felt all her classmates freeze from it. The girl stood in front of the class, blushing with humiliation, not realizing what her fault was. These endless petty humiliations, gaining strength every day like invisible threads, entangled her, making her think more and more often about what she was doing wrong. Aaliyah tried to explain to herself why it was her that he was singling her out, what her mistake was, but she found no answer. She began to lose the light and confidence that had been her defense and pride. She silently continued to study, trying to ignore the principal's barbs, but his cold, hard stare now followed her everywhere she went. Her confidence, once strong and clear, began to melt. Her friends noticed that Aaliyah had become quieter, no longer responding actively in class and rarely staying late. There was a shadow of fear and anxiety in her eyes, as if the school, the place where she had always felt free, now had an invisible wall, and behind that wall stood Mr. Cross, a man to whom her success and ability meant nothing, for he saw in her only what he could not change. It was a gray, rainy day, and the clouds hanging over the school seemed to symbolize the impending event. It was the perfect moment for Mr. Cross to show who was in charge and to put Aaliyah in her place. He felt that his patience was wearing thin. Her presence, her desire to be the best, and her out-of-control confidence all made him irritable, and it was growing every day. In history class, Aaliyah was answering a question, confidently stating her thoughts in front of the class. Her voice was clear and her eyes focused. She knew she had prepared thoroughly for the topic, and that gave her confidence. At that moment, Mr. Cross entered the classroom. His appearance was unexpected, and the students fell silent as soon as he stopped at the door. Arms crossed over his chest, he was watching Aaliyah with an icy smile, and that look made her go cold inside. The girl finished her answer, but instead of approving, Mr. Cross stepped forward and said in a loud, pressured voice, "Is that what you think is a decent answer? Is that the level of knowledge you think is sufficient for our school?" His voice, full of mockery and disdain, caused everyone around him to go numb. Aaliyah fell down scenes of eyes, staring at her, not just surprised, but confused, bewildered. She didn't understand why she was being judged so harshly, for she had answered correctly. "You apparently think you're too smart to allow yourself such a shallow answer," he continued, not giving her a chance to say anything in response. She felt her heart racing, but tried to remain calm. Mr. Cross continued to humiliate her in front of the entire class, showering her with a hail of reproaches, each one hurting her more than the last. "Do you never think about how your words sound? Or is it just important to you to get attention?" He said that she lacked discipline, that her manner of answering showed a total disregard for the rules. In that moment, it was as if he had confirmed his desire to suppress her completely, showing everyone that she was not what she wanted to appear. For him, this was a lesson he was teaching not only to her, but to the whole class. Finally, he stepped closer, looking her straight in the eye, and spoke with disdain. "People like you need to learn respect, not brag about your knowledge. Understand?" With those words, he ordered her to come forward and stand in front of the class as he continued his attacks. With a cold, almost enjoying manner, her legs trembled and she could barely hold back tears as she tried not to lose herself under the gaze. Her pride and dignity, everything she had built at this school, now seemed to crumble under the onslaught of his words. The class was dead silent, and her classmates frowned in fear, not daring to move or look in her direction. Aaliyah stood alone, humiliated, discouraged, not understanding why she was being made an outcast. Her heart pounded, and she tried to keep from crying, but it seemed impossible. All her efforts, all her accomplishments, were nothing in Mr. Cross's eyes, and this nothing he was now showing to everyone around her. This scene, so humiliating and cruel, would remain in her memory for a long time. Mr. Cross had succeeded in making her feel small and insignificant. Aaliyah didn't know how to cope with this feeling of humiliation that was tearing her up inside. After the principal's humiliating words, the class fell into a tense silence so thick and heavy that it seemed to be physically palpable. The students sitting at their desks felt a strange, contradictory feeling: confusion, fear, deep shame, and at the same time incomprehension. No one could believe that it was Aaliyah, always so diligent and kind, who had been subjected to such humiliation. Everyone was used to Aaliyah being someone who set an example, on whom the teachers pinned their hopes, and whose successes pleased the whole class. She was a symbol of honesty and labor, and seeing the principal now destroying her dignity in front of the whole class, they were shocked. But despite their sympathy for her, at this moment everyone felt overwhelmed by fear, as if a cloud of fear was enveloping the whole class. No one dared to even glance at the principal, their gazes sliding to the floor or resting on their notebooks. No one dared to intercede, even those who were shocked and indignant in their hearts, for everyone realized that the slightest attempt to interface would provoke the director to even greater aggression. Mr. Cross was known for his intolerance of any objection, especially if it came from those he considered naughty or second-rate students. In his eyes, this protest would only be a confirmation of his preconceived stereotypes that he had cherished for years. From behind, someone shyly whispered to a classmate, "Why is he doing this to her? She didn't do anything wrong." There was only a nod and a silent look toward Aaliyah, who was still standing in front of the class, seemingly broken from the humiliation she had suffered. Each of the students felt guilty that they had remained silent observers, unable to find the courage to support her or even express their disagreement. The classmates knew that Aaliyah was different from them not only because of her success, they also knew that her skin color and her background made her different in the principal's eyes. And perhaps that was his true motive, the one that was so clear in his cruel words. Ever since Aaliyah came to the school, they had noticed that Mr. Cross's attitude toward her was peculiar, even implicitly hostile, as if her successes threatened his idea of the right students. Many of them guessed that the principal saw in her not just a child, but the embodiment of something that caused him to be deeply annoyed and prejudiced. The classmates glanced at each other, but no one dared to look at Aaliyah directly, realizing how difficult it was for her. The air was heavy with acquiescence, as if the principal's fear was overwhelming not only her, but the whole class. Every child felt inside themselves that the truth was on Aaliyah's side, but everyone was trapped in fear of the headmaster, of his unwavering power and cruelty. Even those who wanted to support her realized that they could do nothing but keep their heads down and hope that this moment of humiliation would soon be over. Some tried to hide behind their textbooks, afraid that their own gaze would show Mr. Cross a lack of respect. His words seemed to echo through the classroom, reminding everyone that this school had its own rigid rules, and there was no room for Aaliyah and her kind. As the headmaster continued to glare at her, the whole class seemed to shrink in fear, accepting his verdict as inevitable. Each of the classmates silently suppressed the indignation and fear that was born at the sight of this humiliation. Deep down, they knew that his actions were unjust, that Aaliyah had been the victim of something far more cruel and deeply wrong than a mere educational conversation. And yet, despite this, fear Saturday in their heads, constricting their every movement, as if asserting that there was nothing they could change. So Aaliyah was left alone among her classmates, among those who knew and respected her, but were too scared at that moment to stand up for her. Mr. Cross, as if waiting for a pause in the silent confusion of the class, stepped forward, choosing words filled with venom, cold determination to finish Aaliyah off. He stood at the center of attention, looking at her as if she were a symbol of everything that, in his opinion, destroys discipline and order in the school. His gaze was not only angry, but something more, as if his intention to humiliate her was something personal, something he had been waiting for a long time. "You think the rules aren't for you?" he began coldly. crossing his arms over his chest. His voice, full of contempt, echoed around the classroom. "Are you sure you have the right to study here? You seem to think you're special, don't you?" Aaliyah felt her hands begin to shake slightly, but she held her breath, trying not to show weakness. She knew her successes annoyed him, but she couldn't understand why she was being pursued so fiercely right now. When she had done nothing wrong, she stood with her head down, as if each of his phrases were a weighty blow to her dignity. "I've been noticing your behavior for a while now," he continued, shifting his eyebrow ironically. "And you know what catches my eye? You're always trying to stand out, to show everyone that you're better than everyone else. Smart, aren't you?" He said the word with such derision that several students flinched. His words were sharper than knives, and Aaliyah felt her breath catching. He circled the class with his gaze, as if to draw everyone's attention to the scene, so that every student would understand how wrong her behavior was. "People like you think they are allowed more than the rest of us. You think your successes give you the right to ignore the rules, to think you're above others." There was sarcasm in his voice, and every word was spoken in a way that made Aaliyah feel insignificant, worthless. "Tell me, Aaliyah, do you respect this school at all? Do you respect your teachers, your classmates?" he continued with feigned interest, barely raising an eyebrow, "because your behavior screams that you don't care about anything but your own vanity. You have no discipline, no respect, no idea what it means to be part of the school." His words were like whiplashes that kept falling on her shoulders, making her clench tighter and tighter with pain and shame. But the worst of it was not the words themselves, but the fact that he said them with unconcealed pleasure, as if he found something special in his humiliation of her, something that lifted him above her and proved his power. There was an undercurrent of pride in his gaze, and he was enjoying breaking her confidence slowly fading under his pressure. "I feel sorry for your parents, Aaliyah," he continued, sighing ironically. "They're probably hoping you'll accomplish something someday. And you," he paused, savoring her humiliated look, "you only bring them disappointment. If you can't understand basic things, then why are you here?" Those last words were especially cruel. Aaliyah felt a cold lump rise in her throat, and she struggled to keep from crying. The headmaster continued his accusations, and with each word, she felt more and more like a stranger, unwanted in this classroom, in this place where everyone seemed to be there to support and help her. Her confidence, her light, all that she had built up so long and diligently, was at that moment turning to ashes under the pressure of his endless rebukes. A class, frowning in silence, listened to his accusations and realized that this scene was not just a punishment, but a demonstration of the power that divides people into insiders and outsiders. And in that moment, Aaliyah stood alone, condemned, humiliated and broken under the impenetrable gaze of a man for whom her feelings and dignity were just another obstacle to maintaining his world, where people like her had no right to feel worthy. Mr. Cross was silent for a moment, as if considering how to humiliate Aaliyah even more. His face took on an expression of carefully concealed contempt, and looking at her, he finally spoke, obviously choosing his words to make them seem right, but still as sharp as the previous ones. "You're probably used to having everything forgiven, aren't you?" His voice was both low and cold. He stared intently into her eyes, not allowing her to turn away or hide from his tenacious gaze. "People like you often think the rules aren't for them. Upbringing at home is perhaps not too strict. Perhaps you haven't been instilled with a respect for discipline and order." The class listened with bated breath. Aaliyah felt her heart clench. The words carried an underlying but sharp mockery. She knew what he was talking about. Maddie was referring to her family, her roots, everything that made her different in his eyes. The headmaster continued, becoming more and more engrossed in his own words. "I'm not surprised that you don't know how to behave in a society where there are rules binding on everyone. Perhaps they don't exist where you come from. Or are they different?" His mocking tone, as if random words that could seemingly be overlooked, hid something more in every word. She stood before him, struggling to hold back tears, and tried to understand why she deserved such cruel words. What did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Ran through her mind, but she didn't have the strength to say it out loud. He continued, "You probably think that your self-confidence will allow you to go further, turning a blind eye to important things like discipline. But I'll tell you the truth, people like you rarely go far. Often they end up where they should be. If you know what I'm talking about." His words, full of hidden mockery, elicited nervous glances from several students, but none dared to say anything. Aaliyah stood there, feeling her pride, her dignity slowly crumble under his words. It seemed that each new innuendo, each hidden insulting phrase was literally burning her from the inside out. She had always been proud of her roots, her family, her hard work that had allowed her to excel despite the prejudice she sometimes faced. But now Mr. Cross was taking the confidence away from her like a predator, destroying everything that was important to her. "People like you," he emphasized the expression particularly sharply, "always think they're special for some reason. You may continue to think that your accomplishments mean something, but trust me, in this school, and in life in general, your confidence won't help you if you don't learn to respect the rules. Maybe you thought you were gonna be a star, thought everyone would look up to you." He grinned, showing his contempt, and added, "You're not here to stand out. Your place is in the shadows, and the sooner you realize that, the easier it will be for everyone." His words penetrated deeply, leaving Aaliyah in almost physical pain from such humiliation. They weren't just remarks about her behavior or academic success. They were a direct, hidden under the mask of education, an attack on her personality, on her identity. He continued to stare at her, clearly enjoying the effect of his words. To him, Aaliyah was nothing more than the embodiment of what he considered inappropriate for his school, his world. Still, she gathered her strength and, quietly but firmly, she said, "Mr. Cross, I'm just trying to learn and be the best version of myself. I don't know why I deserve to be told that." Her voice was shaky, but there was an undercurrent of pride in it, an attempt to keep him from completely overwhelming her. He grinned, shaking his head slightly as if her words were just confirmation of his point. "You don't understand, because you've probably never been told the truth. Here you learn among people like you, not those who truly value discipline. And believe me, this school is no place for your experiments. You can't hide your nature behind textbooks and good grades. Sooner or later it will show." The class remained in silence. No one dared to even look at Aaliyah. Her humiliation was so obvious and sharp that it seemed almost physical. She stood before him as a symbol of something that in his mind was not supposed to be a part of his ideal school. And in that moment, Aaliyah realized that this man was not just a strict teacher, but a man for whom her existence was a challenge, a threat to his own prejudices. Aaliyah stood in front of the class, her eyes full of tears, but she struggled to hold them back, fighting the traitorous moisture that would betray her suffering. Her cheeks flushed with resentment and humiliation, but she stared straight ahead, trying not to meet the eyes of either the principal or her classmates. She knew that if she gave into weakness now, if she allowed herself to be hurt for even a moment, it would be a victory for him and a final defeat for her. Her body, normally calm and confident, was trembling now, as if the ground beneath her feet was suddenly no longer solid. Aaliyah felt small and helpless, like those rare nights when she had nightmares and woke up feeling like she couldn't breathe. But this wasn't a dream, not something to just wake up from. This was a real nightmare, played out in front of her friends and the whole class. She could feel their eyes on her, embarrassed, pitying, but as frightened as her own. She was afraid, not just afraid of Mr. Cross's words, but of how alienated and helpless her classmates looked now. They were silent, and that silence spoke louder than any words. It seemed to her that they were now looking at her the way Mr. Cross was looking at her, too, as if she were an outsider who didn't feed into their world. Aaliyah felt her heart clench slowly under the onslaught of pain and despair, but she clenched her teeth tightly, not letting a sound escape. She couldn't show weakness, couldn't let the tears roll down her cheeks in front of him, in front of the one who stood, arms folded across his chest, with a barely concealed smile. His gaze told her that this was exactly what he wanted. Her brokenness, her defeat. Her hands clenched into fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, leaving painful marks. This physical pain was almost salvation, distracting her from the pain of her soul. She tasted iron on her lips and realized she had bitten her lip, holding back her emotions. But it was a small, hidden act of her own strength, her silent resistance, her only way of showing that she wasn't giving up, even if it was imperceptible to others. Why is this happening to me? It was like a whirlwind going through her head. She couldn't understand why she deserved to be treated this way. Yes, she was different, and she'd known it since she was a little girl, but never before had anyone made her feel this otherness so keenly as Mr. Cross. He made her feel that her place here was a mistake, that it was as if she had just happened to be in this class, among those who did not share her life's hardships and cultural traits. She could hear the other students whispering quietly, but even those sounds seemed distant and muffled. She stood alone in this sea of silence and confusion, as if this were not a classroom but a courtroom, where she was accused of just being who she was. Her small shoulders, which were used to holding herself confidently, slumped now, but she continued to stand, not allowing herself to slump into the chair, not allowing herself to sink into despair. With each minute of silence, with each new accusatory look from Mr. Cross, her fear grew. She was afraid that she would lose herself, that this moment would remain in her memory forever as something she could not change, could not forget, but something inside, barely perceptible but persistent, told her that she was not alone, that somewhere deep down, despite her fear, she was stronger than this man, stronger than his humiliation and ridicule. "You can do this," she told herself quietly, clenching her fist tighter and tighter. "You're strong." And even when fear filled her to the core, she knew she wouldn't give up, that she would find the strength to get through this ordeal, no matter how brutal it was. The day after the humiliating scene with Mr. Cross, the school seemed to wake up in a new mood. It seemed that an invisible wave of silence and secret conversations permeated every corridor, every classroom. The story of how the principal humiliated Aliyah in public spread quickly, and its details only sharpened in the students' retellings. Everyone heard something different, but the essence remained unchanged. Aliyah, a diligent and always distinguished student, had become a target for ruthless humiliation. The students discussed the incident in whispers, sometimes with interest, sometimes with awkward laughter, as they do when they don't know how to react to injustice. There were different shades of emotion in each conversation. Some were genuinely shocked, some felt fear, and some quietly, in a half-joking manner, tried to justify Mr. Cross's actions. "Did you hear what he said to her? That people like her can't feed into our order, like she doesn't deserve to be here," her classmates whispered, sitting at their desks, talking at recess and turning around if she walked by. For many, this case was a confirmation of their own hidden fears and doubts. Some students always felt a difference between themselves and Aliyah, seeing her as someone who was a bit of an outsider in their eyes. She seemed to them an enigma, almost a challenge, diligent, intelligent, always ready to prove herself. Although many respected her for her hard work, her successes irritated some of the students, causing a hidden, subtle tension. Now the gap has become even more palpable. Some, hearing Mr. Cross's words about people like her, found in them a confirmation of their own prejudices. They saw in his cruel words something they secretly agreed with, something that made them feel right, belonging to this school. Unlike Aliyah, for them, his words became a kind of justification, a kind of truth that was always between the lines but never spoken aloud. "Well, maybe he's right," said one of the students in the company of his friends. "She's always so special, isn't she? It's like she's taller than the rest of us." "Yeah, she always acts like that," the other girl backed him up, not hiding a chuckle. "Smart and all right. She doesn't belong here, and Mr. Cross has shown just that." But there were others, those who secretly condemned Mr. Cross's behavior. A few students felt real sympathy for Aaliyah. They realized that what the principal had done was wrong, that he had allowed his prejudices to define her place in the school and her worth as a person. For them, it was a shocking reminder of how easily one can be victimized by bias and injustice. But even those who sympathized with her were afraid to express it openly. The fear of possible repercussions was stronger than their sense of justice. "That was awful," one girl said quietly to her friend. Aaliyah had never done anything wrong. "Why did he humiliate her like that?" Her friend nodded, but quickly looked around so no one would hear. Don't talk about it loudly. If Mr. Cross finds out we're discussing it, he might do the same to us." There was a tense silence in the corridors where Aaliyah had passed. Every look, every gesture was now permeated with the same mixture of sympathy, fear, and prejudice. She felt she had become the center of someone else's attention, as if she were walking under an invisible lens under which she was being studied, evaluated, and judged. Some looked at her with pity. Others looked away, pretending not to notice her, so as not to be involved in someone else's problem. Every step she took around the school was now filled with tense silence and silent stares. She realized that this incident had changed the way she was treated, not only by Mr. Cross, but also by her classmates. The feeling of isolation that had originated in the moment of humiliation had now strengthened and spread to all around her. It seemed that she was now a stranger not only to the principal, but to the entire school, to every student who was here. And every day that burden grew heavier and heavier, and the school that had once been her place, her refuge, now became a cold, hostile space in which she had to learn to survive. At night, Aaliyah came home feeling devastated and broken. All the events of the day, the looks from her classmates, the rumors, the whispers, Mr. Cross's relentless words were swirling around in her head. Like an annoying swarm, she felt she couldn't hold it in any longer. Trying to hold back her tears, she went into the house, but her mother took one look at her daughter and knew it all at once. As soon as she stepped through the threshold, her face changed, and she finally allowed herself to show the pain hidden behind the mask of courage. "Aaliyah, what's wrong?" her mother asked anxiously, noticing her daughter's reddened eyes and tense features. She approached Aaliyah, hugged her, and feeling her mother's warmth and care, the girl could not stand it. Tears flowed down her cheeks and she cried, exhausted, as if this flow was releasing her from the accumulated horror and humiliation. Aaliyah sat her day in the kitchen, looking at her mother through her tears, and began to talk about what had happened at school. She told of Mr. Cross, of his humiliating words, of the way he put her in her place, as if she were guilty of something she hadn't done. His every remark, every phrase echoed in her head, as if the principal's voice haunted her, even here at home. He said, I act, like I think I'm better than everyone else. Aaliyah mumbled through her tears. He hinted that I didn't belong here, that I wasn't like everyone else. Her voice trembled, and she added, swallowing her tears, he said it was time for me to understand my place. I just don't understand. Mom, why did he do that to me? I didn't do anything wrong. The mother looked at her daughter, her face growing more tense with each word. Her eyes burned with determination and silent. How pain! She hugged Aaliyah tighter, trying to convey to her that she was not alone, that she was supported and loved. But inside her, too, anger was boiling up, not the bright and blind anger, but the deep and pent-up anger that is familiar to anyone who has ever seen a child treated unfairly. Honey, it's not your fault, the mother said firmly, running her hand through her daughter's hair. You've done nothing to deserve this attitude. Understand, sometimes people like this principal are full of prejudice. It doesn't matter how hard you try, how well you study, how polite and well-mannered you are. To them you will always be different, and they use that as an excuse to humiliate you. Aaliyah looked at her mother, her eyes still full of tears, but there was a dark, almost inexpressible sense of fear and incomprehension in them. Is this how it will always be? Then I'll always be a stranger to them, even if I try, even if I'm the best. Her mother squeezed her hands tightly and looked directly into her daughter's eyes. "No, not always. But you must remember that there are people who fear those who are different. To Mr. Cross, your successes are a challenge, a threat to his narrow views. He sees you not just as a student, but as someone who violates his world, his rules." After these words, a firm determination appeared in her mother's eyes. She knew she couldn't just let this go. Mr. Cross had crossed the line, and his behavior could no longer go without consequences. She knew that if they didn't stand up for themselves now, then people like him would continue to abuse their power, humiliating and insulting others, taking advantage of their position. "Aaliyah, we can't let that man treat you like that. I'll talk to your father and we'll go to school tomorrow," her mother said, a firm determination in her voice. "No one has the right to humiliate you for who you are. You're strong, you're smart, and you don't deserve to be treated that way." There was a strength in her words that passed to Aaliyah as well. She nodded, feeling the fear slowly recede, leaving room for new determination. Her mother reassured her, giving her the confidence she had sorely lacked. She knew there would be a difficult conversation ahead, perhaps even a confrontation. But now she knew she was not alone, and that she had the support of those dearest to her. The next morning, Aaliyah and her parents were on their way to school, and her father paced with determination, an anger blazing in his eyes that was impossible to hide. He barely restrained himself, clenching his fist tightly, each step bringing him closer to Mr. Cross's office. The man, normally calm and judicious, was now like a top-rope ready to burst. He had never expected his daughter, his pride and light, to be subjected to such humiliation, and from a man who was supposed to be concerned for her safety and respect for her person. When Aaliyah told him everything, his heart clenched. Her words, filled with pain and despair, sounded in his mind like a sentence that he could not let stand unanswered. She was his daughter, his blood, who had been going to school every morning with a sparkle in her eyes, dreaming of the future, and now her pride and confidence was shattered. He felt himself living out her pain, her humiliation, and the thought tormented him. As they walked, he addressed her, trying to give her confidence. "You don't deserve this, Aaliyah," he said, looking straight into her eyes. "And this man, no matter how hard he tries, can make you think otherwise. I want you to know that I will always stand up for you. He has no right to break your soul. No man has the right to do that." Aaliyah looked at her father with gratitude, his words and determination giving her strength. She knew that his anger was not just a show of anger, but proof of his love and faith in her. She felt that she was not alone, that her father was willing to fight for her in a way she had never felt before. Her fear of Mr. Cross was gradually giving way to an awareness of the strength of their family support. As they approached the school, Aaliyah's father looked up, his face even more stern. He knew there was a difficult conversation to be had, and he was ready to face Mr. Cross. This man had dared to humiliate his daughter, and he wasn't going to let it get to him. Mr. Cross had to answer for his words, for what he had done, and understand that this kind of treatment of children, of their pride and dignity, was unacceptable. They entered the school building, and the guard, noticing his father's stern look, nodded respectfully, realizing that it was better not to argue with this man. Aaliyah's father walked briskly toward the principal's office, leaving a trail of tense silence and glances from the staff, realizing that something serious was about to happen. When they reached the door of Mr. Cross's study, the father knocked, but did not wait for permission to enter. He opened the door and stepped inside, followed by his mother and Aaliyah. Mr. Cross looked up, clearly surprised at their sudden appearance, but there was a faint shadow of irritation on his face when he saw the stern look from Aaliyah's father. However, his expression changed slightly. He didn't expect to see such determination and strength, but he immediately tried to maintain his usual cold expression. "Mr. Cross," Aaliyah's father's voice was low, calm, but there was a strained, barely contained rage in it. "We need to talk. I want to hear you explain why my daughter has been targeted for humiliation and ridicule in your classes. The headmaster slowly rose from his desk, pretending to remain calm. "Please calm down, mister," he began, but Alia's father interrupted him, not allowing himself to deviate from the main point. "You dared to humiliate my daughter," the father continued firmly, his voice as commanding as a sentence. "You have allowed yourself to speak of her with contempt and derision, as if she were not a person but a tool for your prejudiced views. You think you have the right to point out her place just because she's different. Because she's different." Mr. Cross tried to say something, but the look from Alia's father pierced him like a blade. "You have no idea what she's been through. All these years she's been studying, trying, wanting to excel, and you thought you could destroy her confidence with one disparaging look, one word." Alia's father took a step closer, looking at Mr. Cross in a way that made him look away for a moment, trying to avoid a direct stare. "I will not allow anyone to destroy her dignity. You think you're allowed everything just because you're the principal. You're not, and we're not just going to leave it at that." Mr. Cross, feeling control of the situation slipping away, tried to justify himself, but Alia's father was no longer listening to him. "If you don't understand responsibility for your actions, then you need to be taught. You will answer for your words, Mr. Cross, and for the pain you have caused my daughter." There was an oppressive silence in the room. Alia's father stood opposite the director, staring at him as if he were putting him in his place. Mr. Cross, accustomed to complete control of the situation, was visibly confused by the sudden appearance of Alia's father. Usually parents came in timidly, restrained in their expressions of displeasure, fearing open conflict with the men who wielded such power in the school. But Alia's father looked quite different. His gaze was focused and hard, and he clearly wasn't going to hold back in defense of his daughter. Mr. Cross at first pretended not to be disturbed. He paused, looking at Alia's father with slight disdain, as if he were not a concerned parent, but someone he could allow to say a few words to before he regained control. It seemed to him that a few calm words would be enough to extinguish all the heat, to make his father realize who made the decisions in this school. "Mr. Excuse me, what's your name?" he asked coldly, pretending it was a casual encounter. His voice sounded almost mocking, but a shadow of concern flashed in his eyes as he noticed that Alia's father didn't show an ounce of embarrassment or fear. "It doesn't matter what my name is," the father replied firmly, not taking his eyes off Mr. Cross. "What matters is that I am the father of the girl you chose to humiliate and insult in front of the whole class, and I've come to hear you explain." His voice was firm and threatening, and the room was especially quiet at those words. Mr. Cross allowed himself a brief chuckle, hoping it would turn the situation around. "Look, I don't have to answer to you, Mr. Father," he said with a tinge of irritation. "Classroom discipline and teaching methods are entirely my responsibility, and I don't think you understand what's going on." Alia's father listened carefully to his words, but this explanation only made him angrier. Seeing Mr. Cross trying to hide his true attitude behind superficial words about discipline, he felt his rage rising. "Discipline? You call humiliating my child discipline?" His voice, still restrained but becoming even firmer, echoed in the office. "You made her feel insignificant without any right to do so. You allowed yourself to speak to her as if she were a nobody, as if her efforts mean nothing to you because she's not like the others." He took a step forward, not taking his eyes off Mr. Cross, showing that he would not leave until he heard the answer. Mr. Cross tried to remain calm, but it was clear from the way he interlocked his fingers and the way he nervously slid his gaze across the table that his indifference was only a mask. "I was just doing my job," he replied, avoiding a direct look. "I have to keep order in the school, and if it requires showing the students that rules are important, I don't see anything wrong with what I did." But Alia's father, listening to those words, realized that there was more behind them than simple discipline. He knew that this was not about rules, but about bias, about wanting to break his daughter for who she was, for her dignity and confidence. "Maintain order," repeated the father with a sneer in his voice. His patience at an end. You'll know, Mr. Cross, there's a big difference between keeping order and deliberately humiliating a child for her background, for being different. You called it parenting, but it was just an excuse to vent your prejudice on her. Mr. Cross, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand, tried to change the subject. Look, mister, you must understand that I am the one who decides what is appropriate for students here and what is not. Perhaps your daughter needs further clarification on standards of behavior and following the rules. Aaliyah's father stopped him abruptly, raising his hand. Don't you dare speak of my child with such disdain again. Do you think she broke the rules just because she's different? Or you didn't like that she's too good at what she does? I'm not leaving until I hear an admission of your mistake. Mr. Cross, there was tension in that room, like gunpowder ready to explode. Mr. Cross finally realized that Aaliyah's father was not going to let him get away with it. Aaliyah's father stood in front of Mr. Cross, his voice tense but hard as steel. He had no intention of walking away or softening the tone of the conversation. His eyes reflected both anger and determination, and love for his daughter, whose honor he was prepared to stand for to the end. This moment was the limit for him, the moment when he had to face the man who dared to humiliate his daughter just because she was different. I want an explanation from you, Mr. Cross, he began firmly, not letting the principal look away. What makes you think you have the right to humiliate my daughter by ostentatiously showing her her place in front of the entire class? What makes you think that your prejudiced views can justify such an attitude? You, as principal, should have been protecting her and the other children, not using your position to impose your stereotypes. Mr. Cross, sensing the growing tension, lifted his chin, trying to keep his usual mask. He didn't like being accused of bias, but he was even more annoyed that someone dared to tell him how to behave with his students. He felt that his authority was unchallenged, and Aaliyah's father had crossed the line by challenging his right to have the final say within the school. Look, mister, he deliberately ignored his interlocutor's name, which sounded like an unspoken sign of disrespect. Perhaps you just lack the understanding that there is a system in place here. I run a school with certain principles, and I assure you, I treat all students equally, regardless of their backgrounds. He said the word origin with a special pressure, and Aaliyah's father felt it at once. Behind this mask of equal treatment lay something quite different. Mr. Cross regarded her as different. Her differences irritated him and made him want to suppress her, and it was something more than mere severity. The same, Aaliyah's father raised an eyebrow sarcastically. So, do you call it the same attitude that a child has to listen to you put her in her place, just for daring to be smart, for trying to be better? Or do you see her successes as a challenge to your vision of who's entitled to succeed here? His voice grew louder, and there was a pain in it that he couldn't hide, paying for his daughter, for putting her through such humiliation. Mr. Cross waved it away as if it didn't matter. You see, children like your daughter, they sometimes don't realize boundaries. They think their specialness is an excuse to be superior to the rest of us, and they need to be reminded of their true rules. I'm just doing this for her own good. If she doesn't realize where she belongs, then who's going to teach her that? Those words were the last straw. Aaliyah's father stepped forward, his voice as harsh as a punch. My daughter doesn't need to be reminded of her place. Her place is to be herself, intelligent, capable, and worthy, regardless of how you see her. Do you feel entitled to decide who she should be just because she is different from everyone else? Where is the equality in that? Where is your promise to protect and support all students? Mr. Cross grinned coldly, as if he hadn't heard his words, his face expressing obvious irritation, and he allowed himself to give in to the feeling. Equality, you say? Your daughter thinks she is allowed more than others. She acts as if she doesn't have to obey the general rules, and I feel it is my duty to show her that there is one order for everyone in this school. His voice became sharper, almost contemptuous, and he didn't hide his irritation. This school is not a place to experiment with behavior. It is a place for those who are capable of accepting the rules set forth. Perhaps your daughter doesn't understand that her demonstrative behavior, her attempts to stand out, is not what we encourage here. We value simplicity, discipline, and humility here, not these attempts to show that she is special. Aaliyah's father stood opposite him, and with every word he said, the anger inside him grew stronger. He saw that this man was not going to admit his mistake, that for him Aaliyah was just an example, a problem to be solved, suppressed, adjusted to his narrow understanding of the world. I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Cross. Aaliyah's father's voice was full of determination. He rattled through the silence of the study. My daughter is not just different. She's smart, dignified, strong, and she belongs here not because you allow her to be here, but because she's earned it. And no one, especially a person with a duty to protect the rights of students, has the right to demean her for who she is. Mr. Cross seemed slightly taken aback by these words, but immediately reverted to his cold mask. He was not accustomed to such talk, and was clearly not prepared for his authority to be challenged in this way. However, Aaliyah's father did not back down, his eyes burning with determination. The next time you decide to show space to a child, just because they don't fit your stereotypes, think about where that might lead, Mr. Cross, because I will not allow you to hurt my daughter anymore, nor will I allow you to hurt any other child under your authority. There was a heavy silence in the office again. Mr. Cross, feeling cornered, straightened up sharply and leaned back, trying to assume a confident posture. It was as if he were trying to collect himself, to regain the sense of control that had eluded him because of the intense and angry gaze of Aaliyah's father. After a brief pause, he spoke in a subdued, almost torturedly calm tone. "Let me be clear," he began, trying to speak emphatically, slowly and clearly, as if explaining something obvious to someone unable to grasp simple truths. "My attitude toward your daughter, as toward any other student, is motivated solely by my desire to create order and discipline. It may be hard for you to understand, but I demand behavior from my students that is consistent with the standards of our school. There is nothing personal here." His voice sounded strained, and his eyes showed irritation. It was as if he genuinely did not understand why his father was reacting so strongly to his actions and words. For Mr. Cross, this situation was nothing more than a confrontation with a parent who, in his opinion, was overly concerned about a small remark made for the sake of education. Aaliyah's father, however, was not about to give in to that tone. He looked at the director with disbelief, his gaze telling him that what he was hearing were words, empty excuses with much more behind them than just a desire to keep order. "Now, Mr. Cross continued, after a pause, understand, my words were not directed against your daughter personally, but for the sake of maintaining a general level of discipline. School is a place where every student must understand their role, their responsibilities, and if I notice that some students are, say, flouting the rules or trying to stand out, then I must stop it." Again, there was a subtle note of contempt in his voice, as if he thought that this explanation was exhaustive and precluded any further questions. Aaliyah's father couldn't stand it and interrupted him, sensing that the principal was getting away from the point again. "You talk about copying order, but don't you think that doesn't give you the right to humiliate a child for her aspirations, for her successes? Why does your discipline turn into humiliation for her? Why does she have to hear you tell her that she belongs somewhere down the line? You are undermining her self-confidence, making her feel that she's superfluous, not like everyone else." Mr. Cross faintly wrinkled his nose, but tried not to show his emotions. "I understand your concern, but let's not be dramatic," he said with a dismissive sigh. "My actions have absolutely nothing to do with who your daughter is by birth or where she comes from. We have a wide variety of children in our school, and I treat them all equally and hold them to strict standards. You understand that when I reprimanded her, it was purely out of a desire to help her, to guide her in the right direction." Aaliyah's father heard this, to guide her in the right direction, and could not help but grin bitterly. His gaze reflected all the pain and frustration of the principal's hypocritical cover-up of his prejudices. With educational methods? You call that help? He repeated sarcastically, humiliating a child, making her feel that she doesn't deserve her place, that she should know her place. Is that help? Do you think? Maybe you're saying that humiliation is your way of fostering confidence. You hide your biases behind words about discipline, but in reality, it's just a cover for your bias. Mr. Cross tried to conceal a flash of irritation, but his cold face gave him away. He pulled himself together and replied, in an emphatically calm voice, deliberately ignoring the accusation. Again, I repeat, there is no prejudicial motive of the kind you speak of. Perhaps it is simply difficult for you to understand because you, how shall I put it, have little experience working with children in this kind of environment. My job is to educate and discipline. If someone feels bruised, it may just be a misunderstanding of the school's principles and standards. These words, spoken casually, were the last straw for Aaliyah's father. The principal was not only refusing to acknowledge the error, but it seemed to be questioning her father's ability to understand what was really needed for the school. This was not just an innocent explanation. It was a direct challenge, a demonstration of arrogance, of stubborn confidence in his right to humiliate and impose his views under the guise of discipline. Aaliyah's father stepped closer to the table, his eyes full of anger and determination. I don't need your experience, Mr. Cross, to understand one thing. My daughter has been humiliated in front of her peers and made to feel like a nobody. No matter what you say here, your tone and your attitude say so much more. You think you have the right to decide what place she should occupy, just because she doesn't meet your narrow standards. Mr. Cross could no longer hide his irritation. He lost his patience and replied, this school is a place where students are expected to adhere to certain norms. Perhaps your daughter should reconsider her behavior if she doesn't want to attract attention. If you continue to feel that I have acted inappropriately, you can always go to the school board, but I'm sure I will have good reasons for every action I take. This answer was the last straw for Aaliyah's father. Aaliyah's father stared at Mr. Cross. His face was calm, but emotions were boiling inside. He realized that the principal was deliberately trying to confuse and evade the point. Behind the outer mask of educational measures and discipline was a bias, entrenched and stubborn, that was evident in every word and look of Mr. Cross. Now is the time to call things by their proper names and bring his prejudices to the surface. Mr. Cross, Aaliyah's father began firmly, stepping forward. Let's not hide behind words about discipline and standards. I want you to answer honestly. Why is it that my daughter has become the object of your constant remarks and nagging? Why is it that her successes, her efforts are perceived by you as something that needs to be punished, while you leave other students alone? The principal, sensing that the conversation was taking a dangerous turn, tried to smite him merely. I do not discriminate between students, he replied in an even voice. All my actions are aimed at maintaining unity and order in the school, and if some students exhibit behavior that goes beyond the established norms, I must intervene. There are no special circumstances or differences involved. Aaliyah's father, sensing the familiar cunning in his words, only shook his head. He realized that the principal continued to hide the truth under the cover of norms and standards, but it was these norms that had become the tools to express his bias. Father knew he had to go deeper. You talk about frameworks and norms, he continued, emphasizing each word, but your problem is that you set these norms based on your own ideas of who is worthy of success and who is not. Let's not hide behind pretty words. You have decided that Aaliyah should know her place not because of her actions, but because she doesn't fit into your narrow picture of the world, because she is not like the others. Mr. Cross's face changed slightly, and his cold mask trembled. He started to speak, but Aaliyah's father interrupted him, continuing firmly, you see my daughter as a threat, Mr. Cross, because she breaks your stereotypes, her successes, her pride. It's all like a reproach to you. and instead of supporting her, you use your power to silence her voice, to make her feel like she has no right to stand out. The director tensed, his face contorted with barely contained anger. He tried to defend himself again. That's your speculation, mister. You seem to be trying to accuse me of bias where none exists. I only reprimanded your daughter because she didn't follow the rules, not because of her differences. As you put it, Aaliyah's father raised his eyebrows, his voice sounding increasingly firm. Just because of the rules, are you saying that your constant dissatisfaction with her answers, her behavior, her eagerness to prove herself are just rules? Are you saying that derogatory remarks about her place, innuendos about her otherness are all about discipline too? Stop playing with words, Mr. Cross. I can see you've crossed the line a long time ago. This isn't about rules. This is about your bias. For a moment there was silence in the office, tense and heavy. Mr. Cross did not know what to say. His mask had begun to crumble, and beneath it were the very motives he had tried so hard to conceal. Irritation flashed in his gaze, and then something darker that was closer to hatred. He wasn't used to anyone questioning his methods, much less accusing him of something like that. Aaliyah's father took a deep breath and continued without taking his eyes off the principal. You work with children, Mr. Cross, he said, barely containing his rage, with those who are building their future and searching for their place in this world. And you, instead of inspiring them, supporting them in their aspirations, have chosen to humiliate my daughter for simply being different. But I will not let you continue to do that. I will not allow you to destroy her confidence, her pride, just because she doesn't feed into your narrow picture of the world. The director tried to say something again, but the words stuck in his throat. He realized that his hidden bias was no longer going unnoticed. It had been exposed to the light, and now he had no choice but to either admit his motives or continue to stand his ground, risking losing his already shaky grip on the situation. But Aaliyah's father didn't wait for his answer. He took one last step toward the principal's desk, leaning closer so that his words sounded like a warning. The next time you think about humiliating her for being proud of her accomplishments, for not hiding her strength, remember this conversation. My daughter is not a problem that you can suppress with your arrogance and prejudice. She is worthy of respect and support, and I will not allow you to take away her right to be herself. After these words, Aaliyah's father straightened up and stepped back, giving Mr. Cross the opportunity to finally understand his bias would no longer remain in the shadows. Mr. Cross felt a chill run down his spine. His confidence, his usual sense of authority and control, slowly dissipated, leaving only a strange feeling of fear and insecurity. He wasn't used to this kind of pressure, this kind of open resistance, especially from the students' parents. Usually, when conflicts arose, all they had to do was say a few authoritative words about rules and discipline to smooth things over. But Aaliyah's father was different. Not only did he defy the standard explanations, but it pointed out Mr. Cross's own bias with frightening accuracy, doing so confidently and directly. Aaliyah's father, standing opposite, seemed to embody the force of justice that Mr. Cross had avoided all his career. His stance, the firmness in his voice, and his piercing gaze left no doubt that he would not let this go unnoticed. And this determination of a father willing to fight for his daughter to the end made Mr. Cross feel cornered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his mind began to roll through the implications. He realized that if Aaliyah's father decided to go further, he could bring the case to the school board or even to the district leadership. And what if he, Mr. Cross, suddenly found himself under scrutiny? If this case becomes a precedent and an investigation begins, his reputation will be jeopardized. Rumors would spread quickly, and his bias, which he had so carefully concealed, might come to the surface. The thought flashed through his mind that one incident could be the beginning of the end for his career. He wasn't naive. Being a school principal, especially in a small community, was always about reputation and what people thought of you. And if that reputation was tarnished, all the respect, All the years of work could come crashing down like a house of cards. For him, a man accustomed to power and control, this was the worst-case scenario. Trying to suppress a growing sense of panic, Mr. Cross tried to reason logically. Maybe, he thought, there's something we can do to reassure my father, make him understand that this is a misunderstanding, that his actions have been misinterpreted, but his words had already revealed his true motives too clearly. He realized that there was no turning the conversation back. Meanwhile, Alia's father, noticing the shadow of doubt in the headmaster's eyes, did not move away, continuing to look at him with a firm and confident gaze. He saw how Mr. Cross hesitated, how his face changed as if under the oppression of his own thoughts, and it made him realize that fear had indeed crept into the man's soul. It was now evident that the director was beginning to realize the seriousness of the consequences, that his actions would not remain in the shadows. Finally, Mr. Cross made a short but less confident remark. I realize that I may have seemed strict, but still, as principal, I have to maintain a certain amount of order. It's my responsibility. He tried to bring his voice back to firmness, but his words sounded uncertain, as if he had prepared himself in advance for the possibility that they would not convince Alia's father. The father only shook his head, his face remaining cold and centered. Your responsibility, Mr. Cross, is not to humiliate children or suppress their aspirations. If you think your order justifies humiliation, I will not simply leave it at that. I have every reason to believe that your actions violate my daughter's rights. These words hit Mr. Cross, and he realized that the situation was spinning out of control. His power, familiar and comfortable, was now threatened. For the first time in a long time, he felt he might not be able to cope. This parent, Alia's father, would not stop until he got justice. Trying to keep his anxiety in check, Mr. Cross made one more attempt to convince his father. He swallowed faintly and said, no longer as confident as before, perhaps you're right. Perhaps I should have acted a little softer. I really didn't mean to harm your daughter. My goal has always been, and still is, to create the best possible environment for all students. But Alia's father, seeing his hesitation, only strengthened his resolve. Now he knew that his words were achieving their purpose. He realized that Mr. Cross was afraid of the possible consequences, and that this gave him an opportunity to protect his daughter from injustice. Alia's father was not going to back down. He felt that Mr. Cross had already lost his confidence under pressure, and now it was his turn to show that justice must prevail, that no one, not even the headmaster, had the right to humiliate and oppress others. His father's gaze was firm and resolute, and his every step, his every word, radiated the kind of strength that only a parent who is ready to defend his child to the end can have. Mr. Cross, he began, stepping forward and looking the principal straight in the eye. Your apology, however polite it may seem, will not change the fact that my daughter has suffered humiliation. You used your position not to protect and support her, but to impose your prejudiced views on her. You must be held accountable for your actions. Mr. Cross tried to object, but his voice sounded muffled, as if it had lost its former firmness. I've already said that my goal has always been to create discipline. But Alia's father interrupted him. Don't try to cover yourself with discipline again. I saw you talking to her, heard your words. Everything you said, every derogatory innuendo, every reference to her place, said that to you, she was merely the object of your preconceived notions, and I won't let that go unchallenged. The director, realizing that Alia's father would not accept his empty excuses, felt fear overwhelm him. He did not know how to cope with this pressure, how to regain his confidence. Thoughts flashed chaotically in his mind. What if this situation went behind his office? What if this case went to the school board? Or even worse, to the media? His reputation, his career, everything he'd spent so many years building, could be ruined because of one decision he might have made too hastily, too rashly, succumbing to his own biases. Alia's father meanwhile continued to speak, his voice sounding like a sentence. I demand that you answer for your actions to the school board. This must not go unchallenged. You will need to explain why you allowed yourself to engage in this behavior, why you thought you could humiliate a student for who she is, and if necessary, I will go further to the district office, to the Department of Education. I will not stop until I see that this kind of behavior does not happen again. Mr. Cross felt his palms cover with cold sweat. He could no longer hide behind his usual explanations. Now he stood face to face with a threat to his career, his connections, and his reputation. Aaliyah's father's words struck with precision and ruthlessness, each new argument shattering that image of the infallible leader he had so carefully built up over the years. It was clear to him that his father would not stop there. He saw the man's determination and knew that unless something was done, his position would indeed be jeopardized. Look, he tried again, already restrained, almost pleading. I understand your concern. Let's not jump to conclusions. I'm willing to reconsider my methods. And he hesitated, not knowing what else to say. All his confidence was gone, and now he looked like a man willing to make any concession to stop this conversation. But Aaliyah's father was adamant. It's too late for empty words. Mr. Cross, this isn't about apologies or promises now. My daughter has been harmed. She's been humiliated. She's been suppressed. She's been pointed out her place. And you have to answer for that. If you truly believe your behavior was justified, then I guess you won't be afraid to explain it in front of the school board. The director, realizing that further subterfuge would not help, felt his heart clench with fear. He realized that his reputation might be in jeopardy, and he would have to find a way to avoid consequences that would be ruinous to his career. But Aaliyah's father's words were adamant, and now it was up to him to explain his actions. All right, Mr. Cross said in a surrendered voice, trying to retain some vestiges of his authority. I'm willing to meet with the council and discuss my methods. I didn't mean to offend anyone, and perhaps my words were misunderstood. But Aaliyah's father was no longer listening to his excuses. He knew that justice would be done, and now it was up to him to see it through without letting Mr. Cross get away with it. When Aaliyah's father left Mr. Cross's office, he knew that what he had begun must be finished. He had no doubt that the principal would try to hide behind formalities and personal connections, but he was determined that the incident would come to the attention of the school board, and Mr. Cross would appear before it to explain his actions. That same day, Aaliyah's father sent an official letter to the school board describing the humiliation his daughter had suffered and demanding a fair hearing. News of the father's complaint spread quickly through the school and its administration. School board members, many of whom had known Mr. Cross for years, were surprised by the accusation. Some were inclined to side with him immediately, believing it was a common misunderstanding or a parent's overreaction. But the story of the principal's words and behavior, of how he, using his power, openly humiliated Aaliyah in front of the whole class, made even his most loyal supporters think twice. Doubts began to creep slowly into their thoughts, and this was the beginning of what could turn out to be serious consequences for Mr. Cross. The school board, under pressure from Aaliyah's family, and also realizing the public attention the incident was receiving, had to take action. It was decided to conduct an internal investigation to find out whether the principal had acted within his authority or exceeded it by allowing personal bias against the student. On that appointed day, Director Cross, realizing that the situation was becoming increasingly tense, appeared before the board. His face, usually confident and cold, now looked pale and anxious. He knew that this time his explanations about discipline and general rules might not be enough. This time he was facing people whose evaluation could seriously affect his career and even destroy his reputation that he had been building for years. The board members, their eyes fixed on Mr. Cross, began the meeting with formal questions about his management methods. They didn't get right down to business, but with each passing minute the tension grew, and the director could feel his nervousness increasing. He tried to keep his composure, but he was unable to avoid a tremor in his voice as he explained his behavior. "Dear members of the board," he began, with an effort to contain his excitement, "my goal has always been to maintain order and discipline in the school. You have known me for many years, and you know that I have always been committed to ensuring that our students receive a decent education within rigorous standards." Some of the council members nodded, but their gazes remained cold and distrustful. Aaliyah's father had provided a detailed description of the incident, and they already knew it was not a matter of simple discipline. One of the council members, an older man with sharp facial features and an attentive gaze, interrupted him. "Mr. Cross, we understand your desire for order. However, as for your remarks directed at the student, they sound extremely disturbing. Don't you think your words could have been perceived as prejudicial and degrading to the student?" Mr. Cross struggled to hide his irritation, but realized that any show of aggression would only make the situation worse. "I was just doing my job," he replied dryly, trying to keep his voice calm. "If my words were misinterpreted, I am ready to apologize, but I assure you that I had no prejudice whatsoever." The council continued to ask questions, and with each one Mr. Cross felt the ground slipping from under his feet. It was difficult for him to justify his actions without uncovering his true motives, which he himself may never have fully realized, but which were now obvious to all. Each new question revealed more and more details of his behavior and management methods that had hitherto gone unnoticed or hidden. One of the board members, a woman with soft but perceptive eyes, addressed him directly. "Mr. Cross, I find it difficult to understand how your words directed to the girl could be consistent with your task as an educator and mentor. You have spoken to her about the place and roles you believe she should honor, but those words cannot be seen as anything other than prejudicial and demeaning. If you had a problem with her behavior, why didn't you address it in a private conversation without public humiliation?" Mr. Cross was at a loss for a moment. He knew that this woman was known for her understanding of pedagogy and had always been on the side of fairness. Now he saw that his attempt to hide his bias under the mask of discipline was beginning to crack. All his answers, all his excuses seemed unconvincing, and he realized that the only way out was to admit at least part of his mistake. "Perhaps I really was too harsh," he said in a suppressed voice. "I admit I could have done things differently, but my goal was only to help her understand the norms." Aaliyah's father, who sat on the sidelines and listened attentively to every word, could not help himself. Words about help seem empty when there is bias behind them. "If you wanted to help, why did you choose the path of humiliation? Why did you decide that my daughter should understand her place?" The members of the board looked at each other, and the seriousness of what they had heard was reflected in their gazes. They knew that this was not just a casual violation, but a manifestation of deep-seated prejudice that Mr. Cross was trying to hide under the appearance of strict discipline. From that point on, the investigation took a different turn. The school board's investigation lasted several weeks, and during that time Mr. Cross felt the full weight of his actions. The board put him in front of the facts, student testimony, complaints from Aaliyah's father, and the findings of board members showed that his behavior was not only unacceptable, but destructive. The board recognized that despite Mr. Cross's attempts to justify his words with discipline, it was clear that his actions went beyond professional responsibilities and more personal in nature. His bias was evident to all. The council's decision was an unpleasant and unavoidable reality for Mr. Cross. The council ruled that he was obligated to publicly apologize to Aaliyah and her family. The move was forced, and he realized that not only his current job, but his entire reputation depended on his submission and sincerity. For a man who was used to managing, admitting his guilt in front of his student and her parents was incredibly humiliating. But he had no other choice. The pressure of the board and parents, the threat of losing his position and public opinion, hung over him like a sword of Damocles. On the day set for the public apology, teachers, board members, and PTA representatives gathered at the school. Many came out of curiosity, some out of sympathy for Aaliyah and her family, and some simply because they could not believe that Mr. Cross, a man who had always inspired reverence and fear in everyone, would now apologize to the student he had subjected to such humiliating treatment. Aaliyah came to this meeting with her parents. She was calm, but her eyes reflected both pain and determination. Her father and mother held their dignity and looked directly at Mr. Cross, waiting for him to finally admit his guilt. Aaliyah's father understood that an apology wouldn't fix everything, but it would be a start, a symbol that justice could be done. Mr. Cross entered the hall, his step slow and uncertain. Unlike his usual confident gait, his face was pale, and his gaze, which he usually held high, was fixed on the floor. He felt humiliated, cornered, and the moment made him boil inwardly. But in the face of all those gathered, he had no choice. He stopped in the center of the hall, and there was a tense silence around him. All eyes were on him, and he realized that his words would be appreciated not only by Aaliyah and her family, but by everyone present. He took a deep breath and raised his eyes, trying to keep the expression that should have been sincere. "Aaliyah," he began, his voice sounding hoarse, as if he had to force every word out of him. "I came here to apologize to you for my behavior. My words were unwarranted and hurt you. I realized that as a principal and educator I should have shown understanding and support, but I made a mistake. My actions were not in line with my responsibilities, and I recognize my guilt." His voice was even, but there was still a look of disbelief in the eyes of Aaliyah and her parents. They heard the apology, but it sounded formal, like an obligatory text he was forced to say under pressure. "Nevertheless," Mr. Cross continued, his voice a little quieter, but the tension in it did not diminish. "To your family, Mr. and Mrs." He turned to Aaliyah's parents, stammering slightly, "I apologize for the words and actions I took towards your daughter. I realize that they have caused you pain and disappointment. I am truly sorry that I caused your daughter to be treated unfairly and to feel humiliated." With these words, he seemed to squeeze out the last vestiges of resistance. Mr. Cross felt that his pride had been trampled upon, that he, a man accustomed to authority and respect, had found himself in the role of the guilty party. He hoped that this apology would satisfy the council and the community, if only for a moment, that it would allow him to save face and leave him a chance to keep his job. After his apology, however, there was a long pause. Aaliyah's father stood silent, studying the headmaster with his gaze. He knew that words could not fully heal the pain his daughter had experienced, but he saw that the moment had come to close this chapter. He nodded demurely, as if accepting the apology, though deep down he knew that the wound would remain fresh for a long time to come. Aaliyah, who had been looking at Mr. Cross all this time, finally looked up too, and there was no anger in her eyes, but there was no forgiveness in them either. She just nodded silently in response, acknowledging the apology as a step, but not as closure. Her mother squeezed her hand, and Aaliyah felt her support, just as she had when this humiliation had first begun. After Mr. Cross's public apology, there was a deep silence in the school, as if every corner of the building was absorbing the impact of this unusual event. The students and teachers who had been present at the apology went home silent and thoughtful, as if each of them had witnessed something important, something that had left a mark on their minds. This incident seemed to have changed the atmosphere of the school, making it forever different. For the students, the lesson was unexpected and impressive. They were used to seeing Mr. Cross as an unquestionable authority, as a man who seemed to be untouchable. He had always been stern and confident, and many of them had even feared him. But now there stood before them a man forced to apologize for his mistakes, and this caused many to have conflicting feelings. Some felt relief and a just sense of satisfaction. Others reflected on how easily they themselves had acquiesced when they had witnessed the injustice. Some students remembered the moment when Aaliyah stood in front of the class, blushing with humiliation as Mr. Cross tried to show everyone where she belonged. The moment she was humiliated, they had looked away or lowered their eyes, not daring to stand up for her. Now they felt bitterness and remorse for not supporting her when she needed it most. This incident was an important reminder to them that sometimes even silence can be part of injustice. In class and in the hallways, there was now a lot of discussion about what had happened. School discussions were filled with issues that were usually avoided: equality, respect, and the need to stand up for each other. Many students, especially high school students, realized that they too had a voice, a right to speak up about what they cared about. Some of them even began to question their teachers about how they should respond if they witnessed a similar incident in the future. The teachers, in their role as justice mentors, were forced to reflect and discuss the importance of engagement and how important it is not to remain indifferent. The teachers who witnessed the conflict between the principal and Alia's family also learned a lot. Many of them realized that in school, as anywhere else, injustice can be hidden behind a facade of rules and discipline, and that sometimes even their colleagues can abuse power. Some were appalled by Mr. Cross's behavior and realized that perhaps they, too, could be more considerate of students, show more understanding, and follow less blind rules. For the teachers, it was a lesson in the importance of creating a respectful and supportive school environment where every student feels protected and valued, regardless of their background or identity. In the teacher's lounge, they discussed not only Mr. Cross's behavior, but also their own role in the school. Some teachers reflected on how they could support their students better and the importance of spotting problems before they escalate into serious conflicts. The school board that conducted the investigation also realized an important lesson. The incident was a reminder for them to pay closer attention to the behavior of management and staff. They discussed possible changes in the school's policies to prevent similar situations in the future. It was decided to introduce regular workshops and trainings for teachers and administrators to develop skills in empathy, fair treatment, and respect for students. This incident was not just an incident, it was a turning point for the whole school. A lesson that will stay with students and teachers for years to come. Students were no longer afraid to speak up about their rights and justice, realizing that they mattered and that their opinions were important. The school gradually became a place where everyone understood that injustice cannot be silently watched, because sometimes even one word of support can help those in need. Alia, back in the classroom after the apology, noticed that her classmates were looking at her differently. There was something new in their gazes, respect and understanding. Some of them approached her and apologized for their silence. They understood that her strength and determination had been a lesson not only to Mr. Cross, but to themselves as well. Alia felt more confident now, knowing that her story had helped change the school and make it a little more fair. The case of Alia and her resilience in the face of injustice left a deep mark on the school. Soon her story became a symbol, inspiring not only her classmates, but also students from other classes and even neighboring schools. Her name began to be mentioned in assemblies and class discussions, not as an example of a problem, but as an example of the strength and courage that anyone facing injustice can dare to do. Teachers and administrators, seeing the effects of this conflict, began to pay more attention to how communication between students and teachers was structured. At meetings, the school board openly discussed the need to support and promote equality. The school now had special days dedicated to diversity and acceptance, where students could openly share their stories, talk about their traditions, culture, and dreams. These activities helped to erase boundaries and unite the children, showing that each one of them is an important part of the whole. Alia's story was not just a story about one episode of discrimination. It was a lesson to all, a reminder that bias and injustice are something that must be confronted openly, without fear or hesitation. Now other students who might previously have been silent or hesitant to speak up for their rights have begun to be brave. Inspired by Alia's story, they knew that they would be supported at this school. that they now had the right to speak up and stand up for their dignity. Many of the students, after hearing about Aaliyah's action and the support of her family, began to share their personal stories that had previously gone unheard. Some children who had previously been considered withdrawn or uncommunicative now spoke openly about their difficulties and grievances. Aaliyah's story inspired them to stop being silent and to demand justice when needed. Parents, after learning about the incident and its aftermath, also began to take an interest in how the classroom atmosphere was created and how justice was maintained. The support from Aaliyah's family became an example to other parents who realize how important it is to be involved in their children's school life. Over time, Aaliyah's story spread beyond the school. Her case and her fight for justice became known among teachers and parents in neighboring districts, at conferences, and in discussions of school programs. Her case was cited as an example that sometimes more than discipline is needed. Some schools begin to revise their policies on discipline and respect for students' personalities to prevent similar situations from happening again. Aaliyah unwittingly became a symbol that the school system should protect all children, regardless of their background, skin color, or any other differences. The impact of her story was felt in small gestures. Students no longer passed by when they saw a peer facing injustice. They knew that silence only exacerbated the problem, and now, inspired by Aaliyah's example, they were ready to stand up for each other, to stand up for their own and others' rights. Aaliyah continued her studies with her head held high, becoming an informal leader for many, an example of a person who was able to resist injustice and change the world around her. She knew that her action had helped not only her, but many others as well, and that gave her strength. She now believed that she could achieve anything she set her mind to, knowing that she would always have the support of her family and friends, that her voice was important and mattered. Aaliyah's story was a reminder to everyone. Sometimes one courageous act can change a lot of things. Friends, this story is about strength, courage, and truth. We really want to know what you think about it. Have you had similar experiences in your life where you faced injustice or prejudice? Write about it in the comments. Every experience you have is important, and we appreciate the opportunity to share stories like this together. Remember, you are really important to us. We are grateful to each of you for your support and interest in these topics. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and like it. It will help us continue to raise important issues, share stories, and inspire each other. We wish you a good day.